Welcome. My name is Karen Horn. I'm the co-chair and coordinator of the NOUS Network, and I will be moderating our conversation tonight. As most of you certainly know, NOUS is an international interdisciplinary academic network founded in 2015. If you want to know more about our activities and affiliates, please have a look at our website or at our Facebook or Twitter accounts. We will be talking today about a phenomenon that I admit is not new. When I first gave a talk about the dangers of populism, especially far-right populism, at the Mont Pelerin Society meeting in 2017 in Stockholm, I had the feeling that I needed to explain or convince people that it really was a problem. There was still this habit, especially in some circles, to view populism as a normal feature of the political process. Isn't political competition all about gaining popularity? That was the idea. And I tried to explain that no, populism isn't just normal politics, and it certainly won't make liberal democracy any better, quite to the contrary. And therefore, we should not define away a phenomenon and the ensuing problems that liberal democracy, the open society, and the free market are facing. In the meantime, since 2017, the phenomenon, its problems have grown even bigger. We are no longer shocked by Donald Trump successfully running for US president. We are now fearing that he will be president again, which would have huge geopolitical consequences. We are no longer merely shocked by the extreme right in the Netherlands. Geert Wilders has won the elections. We are no longer shocked by the German AfD reaching 10%, but we have to deal with the fact that their score has doubled in the polls, and they're likely to make a smashing win in the upcoming Eastern regionals. Nils Carlson was the organizer of that Stockholm meeting that I was referring to, and he devoted large chunks of this meeting to what our non-majoritarian crowd considered to be a dangerous trend that needed both reflection and counteraction, if possible. Niels has been thinking about classical liberal answers to populism for many years now, and has just published a book on the topic. Its title is Reviving Classical Liberalism Against Populism. Wisely, it's been made open access. Niels is the founder and former director of the Ratio Institute in Stockholm and a former adjunct professor of political science at the University of Linköping in Sweden. Lovely to have you here. Yes. When I gave that talk in Stockholm in 2017, I ended it with reference to Aurelian Craiutu and his work on the virtue of moderation. Aurelian keeps repeating to us that moderation is not something for the weak, but that it demands a lot of self-control, which you need to be quite strong for. Moderation, among many other great things, can help to cool the climate of political debate down a bit, which might help to avoid the us versus them framing that populists thrive on. I have always liked this point, and I believe that moderation is also something that some classical liberals could have some use for, to say the least. Just like Niels, Aurelian has just published a book. Its title is Why Not Moderation? And it is specifically and interestingly addressed to young people with whose arguments he engages one by one. Aurelian is a professor of political science at Indiana University in the US. Thanks for joining us tonight, Aurelian.
It's a pleasure to be with you all. Thank you.
Our event will be structured as follows. I will first give the floor to Niels for something like 10 to 15 minutes, and then to Aurelian, same thing, also for 10 to 15 minutes. And after their impulses, we will have a first round of discussion between the three of us. Not very long, don't worry. After that, I will open the discussion for the audience so that we can all debate this together. And at that point, I would like to ask you in the audience to use the hand symbol that you're all familiar with, I guess, to indicate that you wish to speak, to ask a question, or make a comment. Then I will refer to you and ask you to speak. Normally, we should end after 2 hours. I think we'll all be exhausted after 2 hours, so that's the time limit we usually keep to. So let's start. Niels, the floor is yours. You have some slides to share. Please go ahead.
Thank you so much, and thank you all for joining this seminar here. Now let's see if this works here. Can you see it?
Fine.
Okay, here we go. So this is a recently published book. It's open access. You can find it on Springer Link or Palgrave Macmillan. And it's about populism and how to fight back. You know, just a few decades ago, liberal ideas were taking over the world. We thought we had won, more or less. You know, we got the Nobel Prizes in economics and all this. And we thought it was, some of us thought it was the end of history. Now it's a very different world, right? So it's very polarized. You have all these populist parties everywhere. I just saw Politico today show that in Europe, half of the countries' populist parties are the largest parties today. And this is the most recent I've seen from The Guardian. In Europe, it's mostly right-wing. In Latin America, it's left-wing. But you have them all over the world. And this book covers, you know, populism in general, not only for the European or American perspective. So what I've tried to do in this book is to understand how they do it, really, in order to make it contestable. What do populists do and how do they do it? Where do these ideas come from? How is it developed? And how can we fight back? Is it possible from a classical liberal idea, from a liberal perspective, to fight back? And what kind of counter strategies can we propose? And populism, there's a wide literature around this, mostly from the left perspective, I would say. So I find that it's three different dimensions of defining characteristics. Some people say you can't define it, you know, it's not an ideology, but I do think we can. So the first one is very, I think, familiar to economists. Unserious, ill-founded policies. Not going to say much about it. Protectionism, you know, unfunded consumption of government expenditures, well, protectionism and so on, all kinds of things like that. Among political scientists and sociologists, this is their definition, I would say. It's a rhetorical style and discourse frame that appeal to the true people. It's very much anti-establishment, anti-elitist. They use this us versus them logic, creating polarization deliberately, you know, trigger the tribal mind of people. They don't use rational argumentation, but emotional arguments. They construct the people through narratives. They create different enemies, enemies that are threatening the essence of the people. They attack media, you know, experts, courts. They demonize opponents. They flaunt the low. I mean, they use a kind of argumentation often that is bad boy behavior, you know, about Trump, but this is Duterte in the Philippines, you know, former president. He bragged about killing people in the streets, you know, having extramarital affairs, but also called both the Pope and the US presidents for sons of whores, you know, and very deliberately so. You want to show you're part of the people, even though you may be very rich or so. There are various versions of this. I'm not going to go through it, but from the left, you usually frame, you know, the elites, the threats as neoliberalism. From the right is all, most of the time, you know, some nationalistic native perspective. They create these, you know, elites, they create the others in various different ways. It could be migrants, it could be Muslims, it could be Jews, it could be immigrants, but it could also be big business, capital owners, you know. And so, it's a kind of collectivistic identity politics, what they do. So populist, according to my analysis, offers a sense of belonging to the nation, class, history, status, social status, religion. They offer a meaning and a purpose to people, you know, to defend people against corrupt elites, threatening others as foreigners and so on. So it's a kind of politics of resentment. People who don't feel recognized are appealed by this. The third dimension, equally important, and that's part of this belief that you represent the true people. Why care about minority rights? Why care about constitutional constraints? Why even care about election results? It's the wrong people about it. They don't really count. So they really believe, that they want to have elections, but not a liberal democracy. So it's a kind of, what's happened is a kind of enemy within democracy itself. And it's deeply illiberal, of course. So how can we explain this? I devote a lot of time in this book to go through all the proposed explanations like globalization, immigration, various policy failures, social media, echo chambers, and all this. But my conclusion is that this is nothing new, that we have these challenges. It's nothing new that we have policies that need to be developed and changed in a changed world. It's these beliefs, these populist ideas and beliefs that frame through this rhetoric, how we interpret these kinds of changes. It's nothing new that we have created destruction, that globalization and things, threatens existing jobs or industries and so on. But the populists have framed this in a certain way through appealing to the interest and identity of the people. That's the key thing. So it's a slow creeping way of creating authoritarian societies. These ideas have a long background. I argue that they go back to people like Carl Friedrich Nietzsche, who believed that reality could be constructed, ideas that later were developed, in critical theory and postmodernism. But the most important thinkers here, I would say, are Carl Schmitt and Martin Heidegger. According to Carl Schmitt, the essence of politics was to define, to construct these enemies to the people. That's how you got influence in politics. And the leading figures today are the ones at the bottom here, Nasser Laclau and Chantal Mouffe, both very left-wing philosophers, political theorists who developed the ideas of populism, and they refer explicitly to Carl Schmitt in their thinking. And they inspired people like Bannon and others, on the right as well. So it's a very developed way of influencing politics. So how can we fight back against this? Of course, classical liberals or liberals can't use the methods of the populists themselves. I mean, we can't lie, we can't create conspiracies, we can't flaunt the law. We want to be rational, we want to have open arguments and so on. So I go through how I interpret classical liberalism in 3 dimensions. And I think the first 2 ones are very well known to all of you, liberal institutions, the liberal economy and society with spontaneous orders, markets, civil society, voluntary corporations, and so on. And of course, we can do things here. I list a number of reforms. We do need to reform those policy failures that do exist in our society when it comes to education and law and order and many other different things, corruption, very dangerous. But my contribution here is really what I call the liberal spirit, the third dimension of liberalism that I do think we have tended to forget a bit about. So we as classical liberals rejoice in self-authorship, individual development, entrepreneurship, diversity and tolerance, free speech, rational discourse, voluntary cooperation, and moderation, Aurelian. That's a kind of culture that we as classical liberals support, as well as the institutions, the ideas, and the market economy and the liberal society. So I think we need to embrace and promote this liberal spirit. So it's a politics of pluralism and tolerance. We believe in pluralism here. The good is not something that the state should define or enforce. It's something that we create as individuals. And we should recognize them and value how different personal, social, and normative identities emerge and what we can learn from them. So it's a idea about equal dignity and equal respect. And it's not only enrichment. I do think economists have been very important in explaining, well, how the economy works, how society works to a certain extent, but it's also about emancipation, human flourishing, and these kinds of ideas that I think we need to emphasize more. And we do need, as the populists do, we need to create liberal narratives to explain this in a better way to ordinary people. So this is basically my argument. I'm going to stop here, and I'm happy to answer questions later on. Thank you so much. I'll see if I can take this away.
Thank you so much. Yeah, lovely. I'd like to ask a few questions, but I'll keep that for later. It's Aurelian's turn now. Aurelian, go ahead. You just need to unmute yourself. I muted you because there were interferences.
Thanks. I'm gonna share a PowerPoint document here that will go quickly over it. It's longer than 50 minutes, so it will be 50 minutes to the moment. So I want to talk a little bit about this virtue that Niels has referred to, and I had the opportunity to present earlier on the NOUS network about this. This is a work I've been engaged in for some time. I've been writing perhaps too much on this, but the more I write, the less of it there is in our politics today. So I would like to be in a position where I don't have to praise this virtue. So I'd like to talk briefly about this virtue. These are the books that I've authored on this topic. The most recent one, as Karen pointed out, is Why Not Moderation. So I'd like to give you a sense a little bit about the difficulty of writing about this. There's a lot of skepticism towards this virtue today. It has an image problem in our world of fake news and alternative facts. The reason is very simple. It's very easy to distribute fake news and alternative facts that occupy the headlines. Moderates are usually, not often, described as weak, timid, and indecisive. They are sometimes described as opportunists, mediocre, and petty individuals. And moderation has been equated with an unsavory center, wishy-washy, flip-floppers, and oftentimes on the left-hand side of the political spectrum, moderates are seen as not democratic enough. And moderation is seen as a highly conservative virtue that opposes necessary reforms. That's why it's very difficult to study moderation, as I'm a historian of political thought by training and a lapsed economist. So as a historian of political thought, it's very difficult to study it because it's more than a sensibility and temperament. It's not a positional virtue that is defined by the extremes. It is responding to the existence of the extremes, but it's not entirely, there's a political vision behind moderation. And it's a multifaceted and complex virtue, which is different from justice, equality, and liberty. We have theories of justice, we have theories of liberty, we have theories of equality, but we don't have theories of moderation, because the nature and complexity of this virtue can be captured only by using a historical approach. It's not philosophical, it's not analytical. It requires instead extensive historical forays and comparison between historical contexts. So to study moderation in the plural, because it forms an archipelago of different faces, we need to look at the different uses of moderation and the varying intentions with which it was employed over time. Also, I want to point out for the record that to study moderation, you cannot study it independently of other virtues. It's part of a semantic field. And this is a very important point that I want to make, which is you can't understand moderation unless you understand its synonyms like temperance, prudence, civility, and antonyms, fanaticism, extremism, radicalism. So you need to study both antonyms and synonyms of moderation in order to put it in the right semantic field. So this is a difficult concept to study. I would say more difficult than justice, more difficult than liberty, more difficult than equality. It forms what I call a archipelago, and it's an archipelago that has a classical as well as a modern tradition. Here on this handout, I have some quotes from the classical authors. Most of you are, of course, familiar with the metaphor of the golden mean as a face of moderation. This appears, of course, in Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics, but there's also an understanding of moderation as concordia ordinum. This is in Cicero. It's a beautiful quote that is taken from his book on the Republic, De Republica, in which he complains, he compares the state with a choir, and different voices form different tones, and that's moderation. Concordia ordinum, the concord, the harmony between the orders. That's the classical tradition, but there is also an early modern and modern part of the tradition. We'll go quickly over this, but I want to remind a few moments in this history of moderation. Machiavelli praises the Roman constitution as a form of mixed government. That's in the discourses, and that's a form of moderation. La Bruyere, in the characters, calls moderation a divine virtues, whereas everything that partakes of the extremes is imperfect and shares in the shortcomings of human beings. Pascal himself, in his famous Pensée, claims that nature has placed us in the middle. That's a phase of moderation, and the greatness of the human condition consists in knowing how to remain there. My favorite of this is Baltasar Gracian, the author of the most important book on prudence, which is another synonym of moderation. And moderation is related to prudence, which is a concept with deep roots in medieval theology, a natural virtue of the soul that gives us the inner knowledge of moral truth and allows us to avoid the extremes. So as you can see, all of these thinkers do draw to some extent on the classical authors. Montaigne himself, in the essays, which can be seen as an apology of moderation, does that. He claimed that our most glorious achievement is to live our life fittingly, and I would interpret this with moderation. Now, there are two definitions here that are worth highlighting, and I'm very fond of the first one, which comes from Joseph Hall in 1640. There's nothing, therefore, in the world more wholesome than this gracious lesson of moderation, which he defines as the silken string that runs through the pearl chain of all virtues. That's the first one in 1640. 40 years later, Marquis of Halifax defines moderation as a form of trimming, and he gives the definition of the trimming in his famous essay, The Character of the Trimmer. It's a nautical metaphor, trimming the sail of the ship of the state to prevent it from capsizing. In the age of the Enlightenment and the Revolution, moderation acquires for the first time a distinctive political meaning, which becomes predominant in the 1700s. And here I'd like to highlight two things that are important for our conversation. There's a relationship between moderation and institutional complexity, where we have mixture of different groups, equipoise, balance, harmony between orders. That's where we will encounter moderation. And you see in the 18th century moderation developing as an antonym of fanaticism and enthusiasm. And you have this in the works of Hume, Voltaire, and the authors, some of the authors of the essays in the Encyclopédie, in particular Jarcourt and Dallaire. There's also a connection with toleration and civility that I will leave for the conversation if anyone's interesting. Now, here, I like to highlight the importance of Montesquieu. We don't have time to talk a lot about Montesquieu, but in the history of moderation, Montesquieu plays a key role because he defined moderation as the supreme virtue of the legislator. And he writes at the end in book 29 of The Spirit of the Laws, I've written this only to prove it. The spirit of moderation should be that of the legislator. Moderation is redefined as symphonia discourse, a symphony of the orders there, and he comes with a definition of the moderate government. And that's the definition that you find in book 5, chapter 14. One must combine powers, regulate them, temper them, make them act. One must give one power a ballast, so to speak, to put it in a position to resist another. And he obviously comes to the conclusion that this is a work of art, a masterpiece of legislation that is difficult to acquire. Moderation, of course, was part of the English Constitution and what Montesquieu called the Gothic government. Now, his legacy is important. We don't have time to talk a lot about this, but moderation is part of the definition of the mixed government, and Montesquieu's conclusions appears in the famous chapter 6 of book 11. You see there moderation connected to balance of powers and political pluralism as prerequisites of a free society. The other thing that is important to retain from Montesquieu's analysis is that he defined the political good as multidimensional, not one-dimensional, multidimensional. And that's important because then he refused to give the direction of the Commonwealth to a single body or person, and that would be the definition of Hobbes, that would be the definition of Rousseau's theory of sovereignty, and he endorsed a pluralist understanding of sovereignty. Montesquieu had many heirs in France. I don't have time to talk about them. I want to signal them. One is Jacques Necker, the Minister of Finance, and then the Prime Minister of Louis XVI. He came up with a very interesting concept of the interlacing of powers. In French, the term is l'entrelacement des pouvoirs, and he came up with a kind of a redefinition of executive and legislative power as or leadership and supervision. The other one would be Madame de Staël, who put moderation at the heart of her critique of fanaticism after the revolution. And of course, you have Benjamin Constant's work, especially with his theory of neutral power, defined as a moderating power above the fray. And that is the key point of his theory of representative government. The neutral power had some antecedents in France, but it was Constant that put forward this understanding of neutral power as a trimmer, seeking the sheep to keep the sheep on an even keel. Now, we live not in the world of Montesquieu's or Montesquieu's heirs, but in our post-truth world. So the question is, can it be a successful card in today's politics? We have hyperpolarization, tribalism, sectarianism, and of course, the challenges of populism. And we've seen politicians always, often, unfortunately, using the phrase my way or the highway. We live in a no compromise era, us versus them, litmus tests, purity tests, cancel culture, you name it. Moderation alone, of course, does not have answers to all of these discontents and challenges. But I think that our world still needs moderation because we live in a world of many shades of gray. I don't know how many there, but certainly it's not black and white. So this is the image that I like for moderation. This is I think a good way to describe the difficulty of moderation, how to place all of these weights so that the ship of the state remains on an even keel. And this is the other image of moderation that I use as a cover for one of my previous books. This is a funambulist tightrope walker. Imagine what it would take to maintain one's balance up there. Now, there are many benefits of moderation that I highlight in the new book. I would like to highlight three of them. One is that it's not an ideology with fixed contours. It's much more than proverbial golden mean. It has affinities with different political tradition, and it can accommodate a wider range of political, moral, and religious ideas and forms of government. Second advantage that I'm keen on emphasizing for the conversation today, it allows us to think politically as opposed to thinking ideologically. It refuses to define one single best way, makes us aware that the political good is always multi-dimensional and pluralistic, not one-dimensional. And finally, there are other advantages here. I think it fosters a flexible and skeptical mindset, which is the opposite of fanaticism and dogmatism. Those are some of the benefits. And I think that moderation can be defined, and I try to define in my book as a magnetic idea, as a virtue, as a social practice, as an intellectual sensibility, as a way of life, as an ethos, as a set of institutions, as I try to show in the wake of Montesquieu, and a constitutional structure. It's not a weak form of centrism, a lukewarm third way compromise, or a justification of existing hierarchy. The book Why Not Moderation defines this virtue as a radical virtue. And I end the book, which is conceived as a dialogue with two imaginary young radicals, Lauren from the left, Rob from the right, with a series of rules for radical moderates. And I do have a number of rules here, but I put only a few here. Refuse to define one single best way. Examine facts, be prepared to amend and nuance your belief when facts change. Avoid echo chambers and bubbles. Do not be sectarian. Keep the lines of dialogue open with your opponents. Start working with the world as is, not as it should be. Do not become obsessed with purity and axis of evil, litmus tests, the red lines, and moreover, refuse the temptation to divide the universe between the forces of light and the forces of darkness. And finally, no particular belief should hurt you in political life. Most political issues can have and do have more than one side. And it's important to resist the temptation to interpret political events in light of one single values, be that liberty, equality, social justice, First Amendment, Second Amendment of the US Constitution, you name it. So recap briefly here, without moderation, every man in power becomes a ravenous beast of prey. This is John Adams saying this in the early 1800s. And Albert Camus said, our world does not need tepid souls, it needs burning hearts, men and women, I would add, who know the proper place of moderation. Thank you, and I look forward to hearing what you think about this virtue.
Thank you so much, Aurelian. That was a tour de force. Very, very inspiring. Thank you. I think we will have time to go into more detail and greater depth later on. But in order to sort of tie the two presentations together, let me begin by asking a very simple question, and that is, given where we stand, and given that you both seem to suggest projects that are relatively long-term. I mean, you don't rediscover and spread the liberal spirit that Mills advocated for so easily and so quickly, and you probably don't learn, or a whole generation doesn't learn the virtue of moderation that quickly. So I wonder whether, in spite of this long-termism of your projects, you're still optimistic that the trend can somehow be turned around. I mean, as realists, you might have doubts on that, and if you do, what does it mean? Does it mean that populism and authoritarianism will not be stopped? Does it mean that well, we are entering into a new era, or we are already in it, and we won't see the end of this? What's your outlook generally on these phenomena?
May I start, or?
Yes, sure. I'd just like to say there are already 4 hands up, but you know that you'll have to wait a bit because the conversation is first going to be among the 3 of us, right?
I agree, it's a long-term project, but we can't wait for the long run. We'll be dead, as you know. So, no, really, it's. I argue in the book that the first thing we should do is to really show people how they are manipulated. You know, it's these populist strategies are very deliberate. They construct the people, they construct the enemies. The consequences of these kinds of policies are very negative, especially for the groups that they are said to favor. There's been extensive good studies of this by good economists. And we also need, of course, a short-term reform agenda, I think, you know, to handle many of these problems that our society faces. So I argue in a sense that, you know, classical liberals or liberals in general have, you know, opened up a kind of idea vacuum, you know, that's been filled by these very dangerous ideas. So I do think I can name a number of reforms we need to support. You know, social mobility. We need to handle the social media problems in various ways. But the reason I mentioned, you know, this liberal spirit, I emphasize that, is that I don't think rational argumentation is enough. You know, we tried that, so we need to appeal, in a sense, to the identity and meaning and belonging and community of people. You know, we need to use narratives, and we can do that. We haven't done our job. That's basically my argument.
Yeah,
We'll be optimistic. As a classical, we're always optimistic. Part of the Constitution.
Very good. Aurelian, what about you? How optimistic are you?
Very briefly here, I've written the book with a epigraph from Tocqueville's Democracy in America that says This book follows in no one's train exactly. By writing it, I did not mean either to serve or combat any party. I set about to see not differently, but further than parties. And while they are concerned with the next day, I wanted to think about the future. How about that for modesty and humility, right? But I do think that we need to think both with humility and with boldness, and that's why I defend a form of radical moderation. Two things I would like to say here. One is that um, what moderates can do, and all of us can do, is to lower the political temperature of the game right now. In the United States, in Europe, all over the world, the temperature is too high. How can we do that? Well, we can start with us. Polarization, sectarianism, start at the local level. In the United States, there are lots of organizations that have started rebuilding the civic bridges. One of them, I like to give an example, is called Braver Angels. Braver Angels started as Better Angels. They are an organization founded in 2016, relatively new. What they want to do is to apply kind of family therapy techniques to political issues. So they bring 6 Democrats or 8 Democrats, 6 Republicans. They spend a day together. They talk about their biases, misconceptions, aspirations, whatever, expectations, and so forth. And they learn to talk to each other, listening. So that's at the local level. It's not enough because the game is national, international, and so forth. The other thing that I would like to say, but they need to be encouraged. More of these initiatives would be needed to lower the temperature. The other thing that I would like to say is that Alan Kahan, who is a distinguished intellectual historian, has a new book called Freedom from Fear. The last chapter of the book deals with the challenges of populism. What Alan Kahan says in this book is important. Liberalism, as it has evolved, classical liberalism as well, in the last century, half century or so, has lost track of one of its pillars. Traditionally, liberals emphasize 3 pillars: economic markets, political limited government, and morals, kind of religion, morality, culture. Liberals have been, in the John Rawls's tradition, have been reluctant to emphasize the 3rd pillar, the moral, religious, cultural pillar. And that has allowed populists to make an inroad in the public debate. And the only way for liberalism to come back, and I see moderation linked to liberalism here, to come back and defend a vigorous type of liberalism, is to recover the 3rd pillar, which is the moral culture pillar. So we need a 3-pillared, so to speak, form of liberalism today that does not shy away from talking about issues such as culture, religion, patriotism, forms of belonging that Niels was mentioning. These were issues that are made impossible by Rawls's political liberalism, which denies any hearsay to comprehensive doctrines. Okay, so I think that that's what we can do, and what some liberals have done. And I want to end my short intervention with a nice quote from Wilhelm Röpke, one of our heroes here, who said in 1933, February 1933, what a time, right? Rarely in history has a group of people been so busy helping to saw off the branch on which they sit. And this is what most of us who even are displeased with liberalism, some critics are more so than us, have been doing, trying to cut off the branch on which we all sit. We still need rule of law. We still need pluralism. We still need separation of powers. So clamoring for regime change while you have the freedom to speak is an irresponsible position.
Yeah, thank you very much. I think Niels will agree. The next question that I have for you, Niels, is actually, well, I think that the two of you agree on this point that the liberal spirit and these softer issues need to be a little bit more in the foreground, and liberalism has a little bit of a void there, and that needs to be filled. But what about the 2 other fields that you mentioned? You talked about the other 2 dimensions of classical liberalism, which is well, what was it?
Institutions, the economy, and civil society.
Exactly. Well, but those where you say that's been covered, economics, free markets, we've been talking about that all the time, so we don't have much to do there. I would like to challenge you in that respect. Isn't it the case that some of the issues we have to deal with nowadays, I mean, sort of political challenges that we face, um, can the two dimensions, the two first dimensions of liberalism, really cater to that? Can they really answer the challenges? My feeling or my instinct would be that especially the younger generation thinks that no, it can't. Things like um, the threat of climate change or the global threat of war is not something you will solve with open markets. um, we need perhaps another dimension to that as well. So my question is whether you really think that these familiar dimensions of classical liberalism are up to date.
I very much think so, actually. It's I think all other ideologies are compatible with populism. Classical liberal is not. And it's very important to understand this, that these institutions that we defined as what creates, the spontaneous orders of markets and civil society are the institutions that in the long run create, the open society and so on. And it's not only property rights, it's the rule of law, it's the protection of minorities, it's pluralist society, it's families, it's communities. So we've emphasized markets a lot, in the last decades, I would say, and lots of efficiency arguments, but we've forgotten about, communities, civil society. We've forgotten about Repke's. I like Repke a lot too, so Aurelian and I are in agreement. But we also forgotten about what I call the liberal spirit. You may call it moral arguments, you may call it, human flourishing, emancipation. I think those dimensions can be very, very attractive to younger people. When it comes to, law and order, we have to fix that, of course. It's a big challenge in many societies today. The same thing about, global warming and all kinds of environmental problems. We need to fix that. So if we believe that institutions matter, and we really believe so, as classical liberals, we have to contribute to those discussions and explain how various changes in tax laws, in property right, defining property rights, and so on, can be used to solve these problems as well. The answer is not central government and state-run enterprises and stuff like that in this area either. So if we want to promote innovation, new ways of handling this, we should promote markets. And we haven't made those arguments very well, to be honest.
Yep. Thanks. Aurelian, something to add?
Yeah, I would like to build upon what Neil said and add and emphasize that we need to understand that there are conditions beyond the realm of economic exchanges that transcend the sphere of the market that we need to take into account in our political, cultural, economic analysis. This is, for example, the set of bourgeois virtues that Deirdre McCloskey and others have been talking, building upon the theory of moral sentiments that was developed by Adam Smith. And they include prudence, thrift, courage, respect for tradition, a sense of duty, civic mindedness, propriety, honesty, and moderation. So these are all part of a set of bourgeois virtues, as Deirdre calls them, that make free markets work well. And I just want to remind, it was Roque himself who said that the vital things that give meaning, dignity, beauty, and richness to life are always beyond, right? Beyond the sphere of the demand and supply. Jenseits von Angebot und Nachfrage. That's the title of his last major book. A man does not simply live by radio, automobiles, and refrigerators alone, Röpke wrote, but by the whole unpurchasable world beyond the market and turnover figures, the world of dignity, beauty, poetry, grace, chivalry, love, and friendship. And this is the world of community. And we need to talk about these issues. And I think that political theorists in particular have shied away from talking about these issues because they are part of comprehensive doctrines that we will not agree upon. Well, how do How does one define beauty, dignity, whatever? But I think that's important, and that's why the populists have made inroads into public debates, because they talk about these issues, and community is one, belonging is another one, and I think that those topics need to be recovered by liberals and moderates.
Aurelian, and perhaps also Niels, could it be that these topics haven't been addressed by liberalism because it's so difficult to be moderate in such discussions? Because these things are items that are so close to our hearts that we tend to defend them very vigorously, and we clash much more easily than when we talk about more abstract things such as the rule of law. When you begin to talk about God or the family values and things like that, you are concerned very personally in who you are and what you are. So it's more difficult to be moderate. And by the way, Rutger, whom you cited, Aurelian, he was, as a person, he was by far not a moderate. So you see how difficult this can be.
Well, I think one of the big insights for me in writing this book was the importance of meaning, the importance of belonging. So as economists, we usually think of people being rational and self-interested, perhaps, having wider interest than just self-interest. But my insight in this book actually is that we're seeking meaning and belonging to a much larger extent. And that's what the populists offer. But I do think that liberal, open society, a pluralistic society, has a better way to offer that to people. More people can flourish, more people can self-author their lives, together with others and so on, in a pluralistic society upheld by these classical liberal institutions. And I do think we need to burn. I mean, moderation is a virtue, I agree with that, but we also need content. We need not just form. And I think we have to cherish these classical liberal ideas to a larger extent and be willing to fight for them. If we don't, we leave the field open to socialists, populists, conservatives that really believe that they should use the state to enforce the good, so to speak. We don't believe that. The good is something that should be defined by all individuals themselves, together with families, communities, and so on.
Aurelian?
I spoke at the beginning about the need to lower the temperature of the political game, and I think I had in mind a definition of politics given by Michael Oakeshott, who is the other hero of my recent book. Oakeshott defines the politics as an area where men sail a boundless and bottomless sea. There is neither harbor for shelter nor floor for anchorage. You just try to keep the ship on an even keel. Now, what's interesting, and I share this intuition, is that politics should always remain a second-rate activity focused on making prudent and constant adjustments to an imperfect reality that is always in permanent flux. And because it's real, and economics as well, is a limited one and involves a certain level of mental vulgarity, if you wish, and a narrowing of horizons, that was Oakeshott's view, then politics should never be allowed to become the central focus of our lives. And this is what happens today, and this is what allows extremists to occupy a center place in our public media. Oftentimes, general interest and constant interest in politics, I think, is a sign of a decay in society, and people should take a passionate interest in other areas. And I think that this is a lesson that we can promote, which is let's lower the temperature. Let's talk about other things than I don't know, abortion in the United States. We need to talk about to invent a new vocabulary for talking about those issues, and not allow the populists and extremists, the extremists in this case, not all populists are extremists, to manipulate the civic discourse.
Right. I have a final challenge for both of you, and then I'll open the discussion for everybody. The final challenge is the question whether you can imagine that there might be such a thing as a classical liberal populist.
Shall I try that? I mean, we have Milei in Argentina right now, I know. He's a populist. Managed to win the election, you know, as a president. But so far, he hasn't been able to implement very many policies, you know. Argentina is the original country of Jean Perón was inspired by he went to Italy, you know, and learned how the fascists worked, you know, and he adapted that to democracy in Argentina, and it's been run by left-wing populists for 4, 5, 6, 7 decades now with disastrous results. So I think it's a good chance for Argentina, but in the long run, it remains to be seen whether it's sustainable, and I doubt it, unfortunately, because he's not a moderate, you know, to pick up Aurelian's point here. We need to be moderate when we implement policies, when we convince people and so on. But I wish him good luck for sure.
Thanks, Aurelian.
I don't have much to add to what Niels said, but I would point out that in my book, I make a case for eclecticism, which means that you can be, let's say, social democrat at some point in economics. You can defend limited government in politics, and you can be a conservative when it comes to religion and tradition. And I like this complex figures, and Milei is certainly not one of them. So classical liberals could become monomaniacs in defending one virtue above all at the expense of others, and that would go against my definition of eclecticism as a form of moderation. So,
yeah, thanks.
If I may add, I mean, I said that during my presentation. As liberals, we cannot use many of the means that populists use. We cannot lie. We cannot demonize our opponents. We can't create conspiracy theories and so on. We should be open. We should, you know, cherish the open society, rational arguments, science, and all this, you know. And they don't. So it's a hard work for us to fight them.
I like that very much. Thank you so much for this part. So I see lots of hands up, and I'll call on you one by one, and you just jump in, giving your answers as you like. Gerhard is first.
Well, thank you very much for these inspiring presentations and these efforts in political ethics, so to say. Just 2 remarks. Well, this links to Wilhelm Röpke. If one takes a broader historical view on democracy, we have seen far more conflicting periods of democracy in the period after, in the 1920s and the 1930s. We had seen a lot of violence, military coups, mass strikes, and militant strikes in society. So as compared to this period, our current period of Western democracy, or our current political theater, seems to be far more moderate. So there, Aurelian made some annotations to music in the Weimar Republic. I made a Liberty Fund conference 2 years ago in the Weimar Republic. The political violence and the outbreaks culminated in the year 1923. This was just the year when the most dissonant type of music emerged. Arnold Schoenberg composed his first 12-tone type of music this time. So we also see that this is a type of conflicts, of dissonance in society, which was caused by a lack of political consent, and also caused by a lack of economic resources to moderate social conflicts in society. I think this was a decisive point. So this is my first remark. My second remark relates much more to Niels, and and the stance of classical liberalism. I would like to stress that classical liberals had an ambivalent stance towards democracy. So they were in favor of political participation and, of course, against an autocratic type of rule, but they were not advocates of full democracy in our current sense. So they view that democracy would be in the rule of the uneducated mass of society over the on the well-educated part of society. So and the role of parliament was viewed far more differently than we do it today. So parliament was not so much seen as a mirror of society or the representation of all political stances and beliefs in society in the parliament. It was more seen as a selection of the best, which includes all layers of society. But they had an ambivalent stance to democracy, and they had foreseen the problems which could arise if all people have a vote. So and so I would like to stress this role of classical liberalism here.
Can I start?
Niels, will you go ahead?
Now it's interesting with the period you mentioned, the 20s and 30s. Many of these ideas were developed by well, conservative thinkers in Germany in those days. I mentioned Carl Schmitt, but there were a number of others, and that did not end well, and not only in Italy, in Germany, but in many other European countries as well. And we have to learn from that, and we learned something. And after the Second World War, democracy took over Europe and large parts of the world. And we thought after, the fall of the Berlin Wall in '89 that the same would happen, and it did happen. But now, the level of democracy in the world is down to 1986 levels. So it's only 13% of the world population that live in free society. And by free, to connect to the second question, I mean liberal democracies, where we uphold the rule of law, minority rights, well, division of powers. Well, you all know this, and so this is, of course, a tension that has been around. How should we look at democracy? Populism, in a sense, is democratic. Some people believe it's very democratic. It's the people. If you take Viktor Orban, for example, in Hungary, he probably has the support of a very large proportion of the society. Even though he controls media, he controls, the election, he controls things, he's most likely quite popular. But he undermines the open society, he undermines the rule of law, he undermines, pluralism and all this, and therefore we, as classical liberals, should be against it. So I think, it's not only classical liberals, but, many political scientists, from Karl Popper to Dahl and others, argue that pluralist democracy requires division of powers, the rule of law. If we attack that, but to be honest, we don't know if it's sustainable. These kind of democracies we have. It's been quite a short period in history, actually, that we have this, and so we need to fight for it, because, to my knowledge, at least, it's the best system we've seen.
Niels, before I ask you, Aurelian, what you would like to add here, I would just like to add a little twist that you might want to go into a little bit more, either of you, and that's precisely, well, this is not only about populism, but also about how we can revive liberalism, classical liberalism, to fight populism. And my challenge is whether within, well, at least the group of people who consider themselves liberals or classical liberals, I'm not sure that for them the value of democracy is as uncontroversial as it is for you, Niels, for example, as you just described it, and as it would be for me. But we have in the liberal literature so many examples of criticism of democracy and the majority principle, etc., that has been read and that has dominated liberal discourse for a long time in a way that bred a sort of aversion to democracy and to politics generally and political liberty, etc. And I wonder whether in that respect, our own tradition hasn't perhaps a share of guilt in the results that we can now see. And maybe we would have to sort of strive to change the discourse within the liberal family as well. Don't you think?
Well, it's democracy needs to be developed as well, and I think especially social media and this kind of echo chambers and how these self-enforcing things is really a challenge, and I don't have a good answer how to handle it really, but we need to think about that. What we're seeing right now is that democracy is destroying itself, basically, I think that populism is an enemy within the democratic societies. And we need to fight that by these constitutional constraints in various forms. If we go back in history and look, from John Stuart Mill onwards, of course, they didn't believe in one man, one vote, They had all kinds of restrictions that they thought were good. And Hayek, take another example, he wanted this, upper chamber, the Senate, which would have a role to control the lower chamber, so to speak, in the parliament. And I think that's a very good idea to have two chamber parliaments, with a certain special role for the upper chamber. And we don't have that in Sweden, for example. We used to have it, up until the early 70s. So it's also democracy need to be developed and be secured. But as I said, it's the best system we've seen.
Aurelian?
Well, I want to point out a few things here very briefly. I want to share the screen that I have here for a moment. Okay, if I can do it. So what do anti-liberals get wrong about liberalism? Okay, there are some standard anti-liberal claims about liberalism, so they are wrong. Liberalism is all about free markets and promotes selfishness, greed. These are the critics of neoliberalism. Liberalism is all about government regulation of markets. That would be the other one. Liberalism is individual in opposition to society, disregards values, traditional values and institutions. Anarchy and disorder are the outcomes of liberal policies. Liberalism is amoral, atheistic, and anti-religion, whatever. And I think that's wrong. So we can definitely fight against that. But this is what they get right, and this is what we can do better. By emphasizing it. Liberal policies should not, do not solve all of our problems. The realm of happiness, the meaning of life, the good life, it's not for liberals to decide it. However, we need to address the issues that are conducive to that, but this is not part of politics, as I said. So we need to acknowledge that. Inequality remains a challenge. Many policy experiments fail or are too costly. Which means that liberal policies exist in a world characterized by instability, uncertainty, and unending contestation. And all wins are provisional in liberal society. And that's why one thing that I would emphasize is that liberal democracy demands more of us than do authoritarian systems. In China, it takes 5 weeks to build a highway. In America, it takes 5 years or whatever. So there are reasons for that. And liberal democracies require that we must be active participants, not passive spectators. So I think there are reasons for which some of our problems are our problems, and there are things that we are accused of doing that we shouldn't be accused of.
Yep, thank you. Let's pass on to Nicholas.
Thank you both for very interesting introductions. So my question has to do, I think, to some extent with terminology, but also there is some content issue as well. It connects to some of the things Aurelian has said, I think, and also to Niels. So my question is, what is, or can one differentiate between challengers to classical liberalism? On the one hand, you have, should we say, authoritarian-leaning populists that you, especially Niels, sort of attack. On the other hand, you have authoritarian ideologues. So why the strict focus on populists as such? I mean, if you have an ideological communist who really wants a communist society with revolution and everything, or an ideological Nazi who wants to sort of introduce a dictatorship, they're not populists at all. Of course, they may appeal to people, but they're not driven by that. They have a conviction that the authoritarian society is the ideal one. But I remember reading a few years ago an article by Anne Applebaum about Orban, and I was a little shocked in my naivete when I read it. She suggested that Orban, in fact, doesn't believe any of the things he says. He just says them because it gives him a lot of money and his friends a lot of money. So he says things that are popular, that are distasteful, but he doesn't really believe any of it. So what is the worst enemy of classical liberalism? Is it a populist who can go either way so long as they achieve some perhaps materialistic, egoistic goal? Or is it an authoritarian ideologue of the more classical kind? Have they disappeared, or aren't they a more dangerous threat in a way because they really believe in something other than, but populists, I guess, by definition, don't really believe in very much. They can go wherever the people are perceived to go if that benefits them. So is it just because it happens to be now that we have these populist parties that you focus on them? But if you compare these two types of enemies of classical liberalism, why this sort of almost exclusive focus on the non-ideological populists rather than the ideological authoritarians?
I suppose you've had this conversation before, but we weren't present. So, Niels, give us an answer.
Good point, Niklas. And as I said, populism is compatible with all ideologies except classical liberalism. So I argue in the book that the Marxist typical argument is extremely populistic, saying that the working class, the ordinary people are pure, capitalists are evil, global companies, the World Bank are evil. So that's a populist way of arguing. I would say that the way fascists argued, in the 20s and 30s and 40s was also using this we against them logic, this deliberate polarization, creating existential enemies to their own group and so on, constructing reality in a sense. So what the argument I'm making is that, yes, ideologies, authoritarian ideologies can in fact be extremly dangerous, and to a large extent they use this kind of populist argument. The interesting thing about a guy like Orban or perhaps even Trump in the US is that I agree with you, they don't have very strong ideological opinions. They just want power, and they use exactly the same kind of argument. In a sense, they are moderates in that sense. They're not ideological, but they're not moderate in the sense I and Aurelian want us to be. So Of course, I mean, China, Cuba, Vietnam, Russia, they are semi-fascist type of countries actually today that are real threats to the free world, of course. And Putin uses this logic as well. Islamists uses this logic as well.
Thanks, Niels. I would like to pass this on to Aurelian again with a slightly additional twist, which is the question whether what makes populism so dangerous as opposed to mere ideology, maybe it's the fact that it's so divisive. It tears the populace apart. It creates these two groups. One are those who are with us and the others are against us.
Right.
Maybe that's something, a technical aspect that doesn't require ideology, but that may have very, very evil consequences for society. And it's not you, Niels, that I'm asking this. This is Aurelian's turn. Aurelian,
Yeah.
where are you?
As an American citizen, I'm concerned about what's going on in our society as of now, and I'm concerned more about the not the enemies, but the opponents from within than the critics from outside. And this is in my response to Niklas' question. And I'll give you an example here. There was an article published in 2016 by Michael J. Anton called the Flight 93 election. Some of you may be familiar with it. If not, it's a very influential article published in the Claremont Review of Books, in which he compared the 2016 elections with the Flight 93 from 2001 that fell over Pennsylvania. It was hijacked by the terrorists. The passenger stormed the cockpit, and they saved the Pentagon, they said. So the problem here is that you cannot compare elections with Flight 93 moments. And when you raise the temperature to that level, then every political election, every political act, every election become an existential threat or now or never moment. Now, I'll give you an example from the Claremont Institute here, Glenn Elmers, who wrote a piece, Conservative is Not Enough, following Joe Biden's election in 2021. He says, let's be blunt, this is Glenn Elmers, a very distinguished conservative. The United States has become two nations occupying the same country. When pressed or in private, many would now agree. Fewer are willing to take the next step and accept that most people living in the United States today are not Americans in any meaningful sense. So as you might expect, the list of suspects is diverse, but it includes those who voted for Joe Biden or against Trump. And Elmers go on to say that many native-born people are no longer Americans, okay, because they are just citizen in name only. So when the populist language reaches this level of distinction, the pure versus the impure, this reminds me of the French Revolution moment, the discourses of Saint-Just, of Robespierre, the pure, the friends of virtue, and the impure, the enemies of virtue. That's a very dangerous moment, and there is a temptation within the populist movement to distinguish between the pure and the impure, the citizens, real ones, and those in name only. And this is something that must be opposed. And these are people from within, not from outside.
All right, thank you. Henry is next.
Hi, first I want to say thank you to everybody. And my question is, what does a successful interpersonal conversation, at eye level with a populist look like? Because we're talking about 20 or 30% or more, people in society, and you can't just ignore them. But it does seem like a difficult balancing act. Maybe some moderation is needed, because if you say things like, well, I understand your concern, then you're sort of making their narratives into a kind of a legitimate thing, when maybe part of what you want to say is that you are being fooled, you are being irrational. But telling somebody they're irrational, it really does damage the relationship. I think that's a much harder thing for me to hear than, for me to hear, Henry, you're wrong. I don't want to hear that. But for me to hear, Henry, you're not thinking straight. That's much harder thing to hear, and it would certainly damage a relationship that I might have. So I don't even know how you do that. But what are your thoughts?
I think that's for Aurelian.
Okay, so let's start. Thank you for your question, Henry. Let's start with a few basic things. So to have a conversation, it requires that we have a real exchange. We need a reality-based network in which facts matter, not alternative facts, not fake news, but facts. So we need to have a series of facts that we can agree upon. We need to rely on evidence. We need to be able to check the accuracy of our views. And we need to amend our views when the facts seem to contradict our beliefs. And I think that that's important. That's a prerequisite. It's what Jonathan Rauch in this book, Constitution of Knowledge, which is a book I like a lot, says it's a prerequisite for conversation with anyone. Now, having said that, it's also important to resist our temptation to divide the world in the forces of the light and the forces of darkness, as I said. So when Hillary Clinton, so it's time for me to criticize the other side now, when Hillary Clinton dismisses a good part of the electorate of Trump as a basket of deplorables in 2016, that's a recipe for disaster. It's exactly as you said, it's a recipe for self-defeat at the end of the day. So that should be avoided as well. Now, it's very difficult to have a conversation with people who believe in conspiracy theories, theories that have nothing to do with the reality-based network. So I think that we can do more to promote fact-based journalism. In the United States, if you open any major news channel, you have opinion-based news channels. You don't have facts. I watch Deutsche Welle for information. Can you believe that? Even BBC World News is BBC World News Asia. I don't get news from Europe in the United States. So we need to promote that kind of fact-based journalism in order to get that, and maybe reduce the importance of opinion journalism, which is so dominant on CNN, MSNBC, Fox News, Newsmax. All of these channels are basically not fact-based channels. So I think that's what we can do and we should do. And one final point I would say, it's important in promoting dialogue to practice the art of self-subversion. Albert Hirschman had the once wonderful article on the art of self-subversion. So sometimes it's good to test your views and amend them, be open to amending them, say, I was wrong. Okay. So I think that's something that we liberals can do.
Yeah, thank you. Let's move on. Egi.
Yeah, I hope that you can hear me. Thank you very much for this very interesting format for setting this up, Karen. And thank you very much, Niels and Aurélien, for your thoughts here. Maybe one disclaimer at the beginning, or the assumption that I rely on. Populism, as we discuss it, especially now with regard to democracy, is based on the premise that the concern of ordinary people is systematically not regarded by politicians that supposedly control the government. Have I understood it correctly that both of you basically stand up to, well, fight against that by even controlling the government, controlling democracy even further? Because there's an you might find inspiring. I just pasted here in the chat box, which is John Matsuzaka's book, Let the People Rule. And here he makes a very interesting, exactly different tenet, which is to save democracy, and in this time of populism, which is here to stay, which you all agree on this, he argues that we would be wiser to build up democratic parts of government and trust the people to govern themselves. So it basically would go exactly the opposite direction compared to the idea of demarchy that Niels earlier mentioned here, quoting Hayek. So therefore, that would be my question. Yeah? So is there a conjoint consent that in the times of populism it would be wiser for us to basically enshrine democracy and do it exactly the opposite way as John Matsuzaka is proposing? Thank you.
Niels, that's
May I?
you.
Good question. And I think we should take it seriously. Now, many people that support populist party feel resentment. They don't trust elites. They don't feel recognized. And what populists do is they appeal to these people by using this we against them logic, you know. And they deliberately create this polarization, you know. And the lesson for us, I think, is that we should recognize that many people in our societies feel that they are not, you know, recognized. We don't respect them in a proper way. Policies don't deliver anymore the way they used to do, you know, in the good old days, as we frame it, you know. And we need to, as I said, you know, develop our policies, you know, try to handle policy failures that's been created, you know, and be moderate and humble, you know, self-critical in many ways. So I think, in a sense, the optimistic thing is that this populist search, you know, gives a strong message to politicians in general, but also to classical liberals, that we really have to care about the needs of ordinary people in a better way, you know. And so to that extent, I think you're correct, you know. But populace, when it goes out of hand, you know, when it gets really dangerous, that's this third, you know, mode or dimension of populism I mentioned, you know, that you really believe so much in the true people and that no restrictions are needed to support this vision that they have, you know, to promote their definition of the good. Then we have to say stop. If we really use politics to enforce the good in that way, we end up in authoritarian societies, which will be a disaster for all of us. But that doesn't mean we shouldn't listen to ordinary people. We should.
Thank you. We'll move on, and it's Lars Peter's turn.
Yes, well, I hope you can hear me quite well.
Yeah.
Thank you both for inspiring presentations and on a very important topic. I would like to touch upon something that hasn't been so much spoken about so far, I think, and that's we may perhaps all share all the populisms we have experienced are to some extent. We can understand their ploy, their kind of plots in a way, how their strategies are that you have written so well about, Niels. But I would like to point to, and my question is really going into the background for the social conditions that are more conducive to let these forces get traction among the people. And of course, I don't think this is happening in a vacuum, social vacuum, certainly. And if you add the historical divisions in society and inequalities and so on, and you add the big challenges we are facing today, like solving the climate challenge in an inclusive way that makes everyone come on board and see that there are. I think liberalism has a lot to say, that we have a potential to do really the great stuff. In the back of my head, I have this well, Alexander Rustow wrote this Freedom and Domination book. Röpke was on the same page, I think, when pointing towards an interesting fact that some social conditions can be conducive to civic under-integration, as they talked about. And civic under-integration of people in the small circles of daily life can be easily compensated by over-integration in collectives, passionate collective communities. And this is of course a social psychology mechanism, and I think there's something in that, and would like you I hope you can respond to that. And another thing, I think the last thing is that I don't think liberalism in a narrow sense is able to take on the big problems. So I think, and I'm even skeptical about the adjective classical. it seems to me to point towards the past and not the living, liberalism, in many ways, and can function as a brake for our liberal imagination and even our abilities, I think, to get on with solving the problems, and then by that doing that, taking out the potential for populists to get social traction. So those are some of my thoughts, immediate thoughts that I have, and I hope you can pick it up or in a way respond to some of those.
Thank you very much, Lars Peter. That were important questions. Who of you two would like to start in answering? Aurelian, perhaps?
Yeah, I gave yesterday a talk in Pittsburgh on this very topic, Hans-Peter, and I tried to show why liberals should be fusionists. So there was a current of thought in mid-20th century America called fusionism in the conservative circles led by Frank Meyer. He wanted to say that those who emphasize virtue should go hand in hand with those who emphasize free markets, and they can be fusionists. And I think that for us to address the challenges of our society today, liberals ought to be fusionists. I emphasize the importance of two schools of thought in promoting this type of neoliberal fusionism. One is the ordoliberalism that some of you know much better than I do, so I'm not going to insist on that. But I'm going to remind you of the Bloomington School of Lynn and Vincent Ostrom, to which I'm closer than most of you, since they were in Bloomington, where I live. And I think that if I were to define their method of studying social cooperation, is eclecticism, and they studied the diversity of institutional forms that must eschew universal blueprints, grand generalization, and they looked at how institutions match local conditions. And I think that they emphasize very importantly the significance of scale and size. Scale is the rock upon which many encouraging reforms are floundering, and politicians and bureaucrats have tended always to take a limited view of what knowledge means, tacit, local, whatever, distributed knowledge. And they also often adopted a state-centered perspective. So what Lynn and Vincent Ostrom and their collaborators demonstrated is that we need to be eclectic in the way in which we study. Sometimes it's the associations, cooperatives, sometimes is the local state, sometimes is the federal level. There are polycentric systems of governance. And I think that that's one of the ways in which we can make our theories more complex and more able to address the diversity of the world, not just one scheme of thought. So complexity does not mean chaos. Complexity does not mean uncertainty. Collective problems are solvable on multiple scales, and some are not solvable on the scales on which we try to approach them. And sweeping bird's eye view solutions to problems of collective actions are going to fail. So a mix must be used. So I want to make an argument for why liberals needs to be fusionists in this sense, okay? And I give an example of the Bloomington School of Lynn and Vincent Ostrom as a possible way of addressing this. It's not a panacea. It's one of the many options available.
May I perhaps add something to this? I'm a big fan of the Bloomington School and the Ostroms. I'm also a big fan of classical liberalism. And one of the reasons I put the title, Reviving Classical Liberalism, is that in the US, you can't really use the term liberal anymore. That's like a left-wing social democrat or something, So you can't use the term neoliberal either. And I discuss these things briefly in the book. And I do think that the classical liberal vision about a strong, limited, and decent state, I would like, let me emphasize the decent part here, but not a state that engages in large-scale redistribution, a huge welfare state that limits liberty to a very big extent, destroys markets, destroys civil society. is, I think, the answer to many of these questions, and it needs to be defended. You know, people don't understand how, as you mentioned, Aurelian, the importance of civil society and the spontaneous order and, well, polycentric orders and so on function. We need to explain that to people, and we need to defend classical liberalism against all these other false ideologies, I would say.
I want to give one concrete example, if I may, of the need to apply different levels. So in Indiana, at the very moment, the state Senate has passed a new education draft bill. It's going to be discussed in the House of Representatives at the state level. The idea is that the politicians here want to apply a top-down way of reforming tenure. As you probably know, tenure is under assault in the United States, mostly in red state frameworks. But this is not how you solve those problems. You need to empower the academics to solve it. So this is the kind of initiative that is, I would say, doomed to fail in the long term, because it will have many unintended consequences that will harm our education. And this is not how liberals should go about reforming tenure, which is a system that is antiquated and it needs reform. But this is not one of them.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, Dan, you've been active in the chat, but I think some questions will be left. So it's your turn.
Yes, thanks. I want to push back a little bit on Niels. He's heard me. We've discussed this at length, but I think, you know, it's good to hear some different perspectives and disagreement. Let me say that I like Niels's whole take on liberalism having big challenges with respect to meaning, solidarity, and so the whole latter part of the book I like a lot, but I have problems with a lot of the other, and about the definition of populism. And the other is that the book gives the impression that the likes of Donald Trump are the biggest threat to classical liberalism, which I think is wrong. Let me go to both of these quickly. On the definition, Niels talks a lot about what other people say, and then he says what he says populism is. And he says unserious. He had a slide today: unserious ideas, divisive rhetoric, tendency towards autocracy. And I was disappointed that Niels doesn't test this against what is and isn't therefore populist. Why isn't Hillary? Why isn't Joe Biden? Why isn't Barack Obama? Why isn't Justin Trudeau populist, if those are sufficient conditions? Maybe they're only necessary conditions, and I'm not sure that makes sense, because then we have the Millet problem, which Niels said is a populist, but at the same time he said CLs can't be populist. So I see a sort of opportunism and looseness and in the way Niels uses the word populism. And on the matter of the greatest threat to classical liberalism and freedom, I think I'm an American. I see it up close very clearly. We've mentioned Hillary. I've mentioned Justin Trudeau. I don't think it's just those two countries. If we look at what's going on, ESG, social credit pushing, DEI, climate extremism, censorship, very, very tilted in one direction, weaponization, lawfare, tampering with the electoral process. It's become extremely blatant, pushing for CB, central bank digital currency, lockdowns, mask mandates, vax mandates. We have the issue of immigration, which cuts both ways. We now have the big issue of foreign war, and the Democrats are the much more unified party on that one. The point is that I'm very Tocquevillian, and Tocqueville said that the greatest fear is not just the tutelary, smothering schoolmaster state, but when that merges with the administrative state to become a rogue, merged force, which will subvert democracy. And that's what I see as happening. And that's the greatest threat by far. I don't think people in Europe get it. I think a lot of classical liberals are in denial about these matters. And I think Niels's book doesn't help on that front. So those are my thoughts.
Shall I take that one, Aurelio?
Sure.
No, it's we discussed this before, Dan, and to be frank, I think you're part of this, very divided American society, and you think that one side is more evil than the other. That's the argument you usually make, It's a choice between, two evils, and you choose on one side. I don't think we should choose either side. I mean, you have populists on both left and right, and they deliberately use this kind of logic and this kind of rhetoric, and they do make attempts to change the constitution, not to respect, opponents and so on. And we should be very much aware of that. And I don't think you are, actually, the way you present this. I very much argue that you have populists on the left as well. I don't mention the figures you mentioned, but I mention other leftists in the US, for example. In the Democratic Party, you have lots of them, some very deliberate. In Sweden, we have a left-wing party, a former communist party, which uses this logic all the time. And I think the Aurelian message here is very, very, very important, in order to avoid these. So now let me expand, this very, polarized type of situation where you can't really trust any media, as I also lived in the US, recently, and it's so divided, and it destroys the society. You think one side is really evil, but the other side, I think, is just as evil or worse even, so it's I try to understand this world that we live in, and it's happening in Sweden as well. In Sweden, we had this moderate party, Aurelian, that you kind of cherish in the book. Now they collaborate, with the Swedish Democrats. So you have this drift also within established parties, like the Conservatives in the UK, the moderates in Sweden, and in many European countries, all the middle parties have disappeared. The Social Democrats, the Christian Democrats, they're gone, basically. It started in Italy and it followed in all other societies.
Tell me, Niels, is Hillary, Biden, Trudeau, are they populists? And if not, why not?
I haven't seen them attack the Constitution the way that Donald Trump does. I haven't.
Oh, they're not populists. You're saying they're not populists.
What I say in the book, what I say in the book is that this kind of rhetoric is prevalent within politics in many, election campaigns and many situations. When it gets really dangerous, it's when you attack the rule of law, when you attack the Constitution, the rights of minorities, and so on. And I think Trump does it in a very explicit way.
So a necessary condition for being a populist is attacking the Constitution. That's what you're saying.
And it gets really dangerous. I think that the people you mentioned very much uses populist arguments all the time. Yeah, sure. I can agree.
They attack the Constitution?
No, I haven't seen it.
Let's not make this a conversation just between the two of you. I think your point is clear, and I think the difference between the two is that Niels is a little bit more along the scale where he says that there might be degrees, there might be different degrees. But let's end this here. I think you've had this dispute many times in Sweden in private. Yeah. Thanks for bringing this up, and thanks, Niels, for your answer. I would like to continue, and now it's Caroline who's next in line.
I appreciated your talks very much. I wanted to respond to a couple of comments. One of them was about the way in which populists attack, I think it was fake news, the media, and experts. And the solution being, and I'm quoting here, we need to handle the social media. I do have some concerns about that because, as you're probably aware, in 2020, we had a lot of misinformation from experts. And the idea of having people's free expression on social media limited seems very counter to what we as liberals believe. I believe that John Stuart Mill was evoked at some point in this conversation. And of course, Mill was very much in favor of free speech, right? We have to have free speech in order to make sure that what we're saying is really accurate, because sometimes it's not. Sometimes it's only partly accurate. Sometimes we just need to be able to remember why we believe something by articulating it. So I want to just express my concerns about the direction of responding to this idea of populism by a kind of censorship that is very counter to my idea of liberalism.
Thank you. Niels first, and then Aurelian.
You know, I have a short chapter on this, or section in the book. You can look at that. And I start exactly where you start, saying that, I mean, we believe, and I still believe, that there's a fantastic potential in this new digitalized way of communication, you know, social media and so on. But it has turned out lately that it really promotes, you know, self-enforcing echo chambers and all this, and foreign powers like Russia, you know, populists, they use it in a very deliberate way, you know, and if we can counter this without having some kind of rules introduced here, perhaps self-introduced rules, you know, by the industry themselves, I don't know. So I leave this open. I actually argue that maybe we could have some order-liberal type of regulations here, you know, some public discourse conform regulations here, you know, in a similar way that for ordinary printed press, you know, we have editors that are responsible for what published, you know, on the newspapers, not allowing, you know, fake news to enter, not attacking people in individuals, you know, in an unfair way, and so on. So I don't have the answer here, but we need to think about it, because this is something that's really clear that it has had, you know, non-beneficial effects as well as the good effects. I don't have the answers here.
Aurelian?
I do have an answer here, a possible one, and this is borrowed from Jonathan Rauch's book, The Constitution of Knowledge. So there are two rules here that he proposes, and I think they are both safe in dealing with the problem that was outlined. One is the fallibilist rule. No one gets the final say in this debate. Everyone must assume one's own and everyone else's fallibility, okay? Always looking for errors and always seeking to correct them. So this means that knowledge, and in the social media, knowledge would advance by conjectures, refutations, open contestation, and there's this empirical rule that no one has personal authority just because one is who one is. So claims to authority that pretend to have a privileged perspective because one is a professor or one belongs to a certain profession or politician is wrong, or race or gender. So those two principles are good, I think, ways of proceeding here. And they remind us that open contestation remains an essential component of the constitution of knowledge. We need to promote a marketplace of persuasion in which we defend rationally our ideas, subject them to criticism, and, as I said earlier, admit error when appropriate. So I think those are the principles, not censorship, of course.
Thank you very much. We have two more in line, and we have 15 minutes left, so that should be enough for you to elaborate nicely on whatever questions come up. The first one in line is Mark.
Yes, thank you very much for your talks. You discussed kind of this notion of belonging and the appeal of belonging that populists oftentimes also confer in a way, the question of identity. And at the same time, I mean, while without dispute we have these things, there are, of course, these other elements like promising job security, addressing questions of inequality, of social mobility, and so forth. There's a whole literature even just on the question of globalization and inequality. And I think it's without dispute that a lot of populists kind of almost promise this escape from globalization as something that they can achieve. And while it seems to me that both of these factors are undoubtedly important, I'm curious if do you think it's worthwhile in trying to figure out the relative importance of, say, these more ideational factors, cultural issues, versus the more material factors, kind of the strict questions of economic well-being and so forth, and the impact they have? Is that this bifurcation, is that kind of a promising path to go down? Do we need to figure out kind of what the relative importance between these different factors are and trying to, as a first step in trying to address some of these issues?
Will I attempt to start?
Yep, please.
It's a similar question to Lars Peder's question, which we didn't answer properly, I think, I mean, it's clear that globalization has effects on societies. I would say, in general, mostly beneficial. It creates larger markets, it creates larger wealth, it promotes prosperity in many ways. But it also, of course, causes creative destruction, jobs disappear, regions are not as attractive anymore, certain kinds of competences are not valued in the market anymore, and so on and so forth. But this is nothing new, same thing about inequality. I think this is something that is framed by the populists, in a way that they connect it with identity, with nativism, and all these things, and it unites both left-wing and right-wing populists, actually, this way of framing things. It's interesting, I think, that many of the Central European populist parties in Europe, they say, and so does the Swedish Democrats in Sweden, for example, they want to protect the welfare state by, fighting globalization, fighting immigration, being protectionist in various ways, being anti the European Union. So it goes very much against, what we as liberals believe in, and what I think history has proved is beneficial to our societies. But this doesn't mean we shouldn't care about the social problems that are caused by these, technological and trade developments we've seen in recent years. So we need to recognize that these are real problems for real people. So we should promote social mobility. I devote a lot of, emphasis in the book to the role of basic education for everyone. It's an answer that is kind of obvious, but our educational systems are failing in those countries, unfortunately, and that's something we really need to focus on. And we haven't done the job there either.
Thanks.
But I don't think we can separate these identity things from meaning things, belonging things from the more material or economic sides now.
Aurelian?
Yeah, I think I have already mentioned that as far as I can understand the current political landscape, liberals have been struggling with the moral pillar. And I mentioned earlier Alan Kahan's book, and I think that the conclusion that we can draw from this is that the glaring weakness of liberalism in the last decades of the 20th century and today is its moral pillar. And I think that any project that would seek to rebuild the liberal legitimacy and strengthen it, as a matter of fact, in the 21st century, must begin with its moral foundation. And I think that populism, properly understood, is not so much the result of a political deficit of representation as much as, or free markets. There is a little bit of that, but there's, I think, a moral challenge to liberalism. The populist rejection of liberalism is a moral rejection. They see liberalism and liberal values as morally corrupt, and I think that this is where we need to bring our voices and contributions. The absence of a strong moral pillar is something that needs to be emphasized here. And I'm amazed by the difficulty that Democrats, for example, in the United States have in talking about patriotism, about immigration, and about religion. These topics have been conceded to the right, to the critics of liberalism from the right, and I think that liberals have the capacities and the abilities, the need also to address this issue. So I think that recovering the moral pillar is a priority for us. I stand here with Alan Kahan.
Great, thanks. Niels, and the other Niels. Niels has it this time.
Yeah, hi. And thanks a lot for both presentations. I like them both a lot. I've been working for some years now on the relationship between ordoliberalism and populism, and I can mostly agree with the things you said, Niels. With Aurelian, I can agree with everything, but I haven't worked on that so much. But yeah, with Niels, I have only slight differences in the. I would, I would maybe pronounce more the similarities ordoliberalism and populism has, and when it comes especially when it comes to the motivation, what drives them. So both are driven, I think, by a deep skepticism towards any kind of political and economical concentration of power and cronyism and all these types of regulatory capture and all these things. So, so they both have more or less the same thing they dislike, but of course, then there's a difference. The populists lack any ideas how to limit permanently the concentration of power, and classical liberalists and all liberalists in particular, they have these ideas. So they have a solution how you can prevent getting more and more authoritarian over time and getting slipping in totalitarian state. So it's, yeah, and you describe it really as like two opposite concepts, and I think this makes it harder to convince any, let's say, potential populist voter that classical liberalism or ordoliberalism might be a good concept for him and his ideas how to limit power. And so, yeah, I think we should use it. It's good news that there's also some similarities, and we should use that to, yeah, to get populist supporters maybe to be convinced about this liberal spirit you talk about and ordoliberalism. So yeah, I would be interested what you think about that, and how maybe also I think you can convince more Dan, because I think he has, yeah, he sees also, when I understood him right, that a lot of populists argue that these deep state things and regulatory capture, that these are really problems and you should address them. And I think we have a good concept to address them.
So what does Niels, the other have to answer to this?
The other Niels has a very good point here. That's been the strategy, I think, of Milei in Argentina, for example. So the Peronistas there has been very corrupt, for ages, and they failed with their policies and so on. And I think much of the support in Trump, original support for Trump, came from the same reasons, that they saw crony behavior, not only crony capitalists, but crony politicians, in DC and the swamp and all this. And for good, the elites, had lost contact in a sense with ordinary people. And people didn't feel recognized. I think, if we go back in history, liberalism was, a force that was against, conservatives, against elites, against, the aristocracy, So at least, in Europe, the history of liberalism was very much united with, labor movements and so on in early periods. So I think, you know, kind of popular liberalism, I think that's a good idea. I should have written more about that. Looking forward to your work on this, Niels.
Could be a next book.
Niels United, yeah.
Niels United, that's a wonderful idea. Niels doubled, Niels square. Aurelian, anything to add?
No, not in particular.
Not now. Okay. So, well, I guess one thing we didn't talk so much about, but time's over, and maybe that's a topic for a next one, a follow-up meeting in this complex, is institutions and how we can make institutions more robust. I think that if one thing has crystallized in this debate about definitions and the wording is that, well, maybe populism is a technique, but it gets dangerous when it really gets authoritarian, and then we have to define what that is. But I think we've seen it in some countries. We have evidence. We see Poland, how difficult it is now for Donald Tusk to undo the undoing of the rule of law in Poland, without being ruthless, as Dr. Turnus would say. Once it gets to that point, or once it gets to January 6th in the US, it is dangerous. And the danger of Milei will be that test. Let's put this differently. The test of Milei will be in that. Will he be tempted to change institutions? Since Parliament doesn't allow his reforms to get through, will he try to circumvent them? Will he try to change the constitution? We will see that, but that's the proof of the pudding is in the eating, and we will see that. How to make institutions more robust, checks and balances more robust, so that these things cannot happen, that I think is something we need to think a lot more about, and maybe we can do that, as I said, in another meeting. Before closing, though, I would just like to mention that the NOUS Network had recently an interdisciplinary workshop on populism, and some of the participants were here today as well. We will soon be publishing papers in a collected volume. It's almost ready, and I would just recommend that you look out for a book. It's a book that will be published with Rick Reuter, a very good German-based English-speaking publisher. So yeah, with that, let me just thank all of you, Niels and Aurelian, for your inputs, which were absolutely inspiring, and for the discussion, and for everybody who, who was part of this and asked inspiring questions, and also for coming together and for taking these concerns seriously.
Thank you. Thank you everyone for good comments. Thank you.
I'm exhausted.
That was one of the purposes. Thanks, and have a nice, evening in Europe and a nice day in the US.
Thank you.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.